The national grid on Wednesday went to 0 megawatts, throwing businesses and homes across the country into darkness as workers of the Transmission Company of Nigeria embarked on a strike. Now, the latest grid collapse, nearly the 10th this year, and is coming amid high cost of diesel, which is already hovering above 800 naira per litre, as well as increasing costs of petrol. Now, despite the over 5 trillion naira subsidy currently being paid by the federal government. So although the power sector was privatized about 8 years ago, the transmission segment, which wheels electricity from the generation plants to the distribution part, is still controlled mostly by the government. Now, the National Union of Electricity Employees had called for an immediate industrial action with a threat to withdraw service. So joining us in the studio to analyze this situation is Chinedu Onyegbola, a power sector specialist and has worked as a special assistant on cross-sector coordination to a former Honorable Minister of Power. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. So we witnessed a blackout a few days ago caused by an industrial action by the electricity workers. What are the issues on ground as the situation stands right now?
Well, thank you for having me. Well, what we know for now is that the industrial action was as a result of angst by the union, stemming from unpaid emoluments post-privatization, which should have been taken care of. And hasn't been taken care of. But we have the assurance now from the ministry. These are debts that were transferred over to the liability company and are being worked out. The modalities are being worked out now. BPE has assured that they are working to resolve all those issues. So from what we know, that was the reason.
Well, we're thinking that privatization would have solved most of these issues.
Well, we must realize that once we propose a solution that it is not an open and close or one-day resolution to the problems or issues that we face.
Okay.
Much like the telecommunication sector, people assume, people have the expectation that that's privatize and then next day problem solved. The power sector requires a whole different process. There's a value chain in the power sector. One, you have the start from the generation, transmission, and distribution, and each part of that value chain has its own bottlenecks, issues, and challenges. So it requires a whole level of coordination. It requires a whole level of regulation. It requires a whole level of investments and engagement with relevant stakeholders, which we should continue to do to ensure that the power sector issues in the country are resolved.
You talk about, you give a sense of what needs to be done, but for the average Nigerian, nearly 10 years into this privatization, should we still be dealing with legacy issues?
Well, it goes to tell, it reminds us that I'm not against a military regime, but democracy is a process. So when you have a democracy, every process that you go through requires engagement, sensitization. It requires an agreement from the stakeholders. So if you trace the history of privatization in the first place, you would notice that even before we privatized the assets, it required a process. There was a lot of pushback by the union. In fact, the owners or the preferred bidders that ended up buying those assets argued that they did not have access to the assets that they were buying. So, which led at the last minute that they claimed that they were buying assets that they did not have full knowledge or understanding about, because the unions prevented them from having access to those, having access to those assets. So what I'm saying is this, that we should be patient, but the challenges that we face in the power sector would also require decisive action by the government, because especially now that we're having big, significant problems and challenges with forex, access to forex. Now, now that we're in a privatized sector, the owners of these assets took foreign loans and they need to repay these loans back. And they need access to forex to do that. They need to enhance or improve the infrastructure. They need to build their capacity post-privatization. An issue that we have in the TCN is that for a number of years, there was little or no action done to build or enhance the capacity of the workers. It was just recently that we had the biggest push to hire engineers into the TCN to replace a good number of the aging and retired TCN staff. So we have bottling problems and issues within the power sector that we need to have a holistic discussion and engagement on. Most recently, in the National Assembly, the Electricity Act has been going through its own process. The Senate has passed that act, and it's now left for the House to do the same, and hopefully the President should sign it. And that act is supposed to do a lot to declog some of the issues that we're having within the power sector.
Okay, I'll come back to you on that act. The worry of a number of Nigerians, it's in the way the whole value chain is structured. Now, you have alluded to the fact that the Gencos and perhaps the Discos are taking foreign loans and they need to service these things. In other words, they need to provide services and services have to be paid for. And there in between, you've got a government-controlled TCN that has legacy issue it had not resolved among its agencies, serving as a clog. The powers have been generated, they cannot be stored. Those have been lost. Businesses did not get service, they obviously cannot part with money. And there is a government go-between, battling with issues that are not exactly technical, that should prevent power from moving from the generation to distribution, is now serving as a clog on the wheel of progress. How do we move on from all of this? You've talked about patience, I hear you. You also talked about investment needs to be. How do we get to a point where both the services that is offered by the government is in tandem, whether it's in terms of speed and service delivery, with the other private sector players in the ecosystem?
Well, I mean, you make a good point. All of us have a responsibility. So you see, one of the biggest issues befuddling the power sector is liquidity. We have an issue of the market not meeting its obligation. And we saw it evident even more so with the strike action of or the act by the unions to sabotage or to cut off the electricity. The allegations or summation of studies that show that for that single day that power was cut, the economy lost about 3 billion naira, and that is just from money that could have been gotten from the sale of power. You haven't included the losses that other businesses, the economy would have incurred just from that singular act. So we have a responsibility as citizens, one, to ensure that we pay our bills, that we don't participate in illegal activities like illegal connection of power, bypass of power. We must also learn to hold our government accountable, right? As citizens, it is our duty, it is our obligation, where when necessary, to hold our government accountable, especially now that the National Assembly is going through the process of passing these new laws, where we must ask the right questions. we must participate in the consumer engagement process to ensure that we understand properly the implications of what this bill is. That is the side of the consumers. The government on its own needs to buckle up. The issue that I see within the power sector is, in all fairness, it is mostly a human problem. It is not to say that as enormous as they are not insurmountable. So we have a situation now that we have a generation capacity of over 13,000 megawatts. But we are limited by transmission. We are limited by distribution. We cannot properly send gas because of liquidity issues when we are not able to pay for the gas that we send out. So it's a whole value chain coordination problem.
Well, a lot of people are actually of the opinion that privatization in the power sector was one of the worst things that could have actually happened, because they argue that a lot of things have actually gone wrong from the NEPA and PHCN that we used to know before to what is obtainable now. You say, yes, consumers have a responsibility to pay for power. A lot of these consumers argue that the power is not even there to pay for. Well, they don't get power, and then they are expected to pay money at the end of the month. That is where the angst comes from. So was there a holistic plan when this privatization thing was conceived? Was there a holistic plan to say, okay, from this period to this period, we're privatizing this, from this period to this period, we're going to do this, and we're going to get here by the end of the day?
So privatization in any country, any situation is not easy. But the motivation behind the privatization was noble, and it was necessary. Because at the time, we were having huge challenges with payments, with infrastructure enhancement or improvement, with government dealing with and managing the whole, because my government it was called NEPA then,
Exactly.
and even till date it still jokes. The joke is never expect power anytime. That's the name of NEPA. So it was just like the oil sector. It was a huge burden in the hands of the government, because they were paying not only subsidy, but they were also dealing with the inefficiency of managing a sector that was not working.
Okay.
So it was necessary to privatize. And the process to privatize was to ensure that it was done in the most efficient and effective manner. And that is why, even when we privatized, there were fail-back safety measures. For example, the liability company was instituted to take over the legacy issues of the defunct PHCN. You had the NBET that was set up as a guarantee, as a warehouse to take up bulk purchase the power, and also via the World Bank partial risk guarantee to protect and secure payments that are supposed to go through the value chain, and to ensure that those payments are made appropriately. So yes, the intention was noble. The actions that led up to it were well planned and well thought out. But we had issues, if you remember then, issues with labor that significantly hurt the process. And there are still more issues now that needs to be resolved. Issues of making sure that the metering gap is closed. But like you said, what we're dealing with an issue where there's little or no power to go around, and it comes with. I mean, I've always made a case that we must consider or look at removing our eyes from the national grid. We must look at how do we now focus our efforts in increasing our power generation and power capacity without too much emphasis on the power grid. Looking at embedded generation, looking at off-grid connections, especially to rural communities, to bridge the.
Is there a plan to do that now?
There is a plan to do that. As you well know, the Rural Education Agency is an agency of the government that is tasked with off-grid connection, mostly for underserved and unserved areas. And they've done tremendously well in bridging that gap. There's a 550 million USD facility by the World Bank and African Development Bank that is done a lot to reduce
Energy question, if you like.
energy issues by providing off-grid power to rural communities across the country using solar home systems and mini-grid solutions.
Okay. Some Nigerians also feels that this truce that appears to be for just 2 weeks feels like a piece of the graveyard. We are just postponing the evil day. If we have been unable to do this in 9 years, if the government could not react since this notice was served in May until they had to shut down transmission, are there chances, that this could be resolved in 2 weeks?
Well, I mean, it's even is a case or concern for the government, and they should take it seriously because it is a national security that a union would or could actually do something like that. In other parts of the world, I remember as far back as 9/11, when fears or concerns that terrorists could sabotage the interest of the United States using the national grid. It was a national grid sabotage that happened, as noble and valid as their cause was. It was a threat to national security. I would hope that it is resolved. I understand that the government has its hands full, and they're dealing with ASO strike, and they're dealing with all kinds of union uprising, and this for them was one more problem that they sure did not want to have to add to their litany of issues that they have to manage to deal with. I do hope that that engagements and meetings with the union are robust and lead to a proper conclusion, because the implications from what we see, what happened, do not look good, and it is an omen for the government.
Right. So moving slightly away from that, but still staying within the realms of the power sector privatization, discos. There was recently there was this lots of confusion, especially in the eyes of the average Nigerian, about the ownership of these discos. It says they have been taken over. Some say that the sales have been reversed. Some are saying that banks are now running the discos, or they're going to be resold again. Lots of confusion being bandied about here and there because the information is coming in bits and pieces. What is the actual situation with the discos right now?
So some discos are going through problems, and the issue is that a good number of these discos have not been remitting or servicing their loans.
Okay.
And so when the privatization happened, there was a shared ownership in both the distribution and the generation entities. So with the distribution entity, I believe government still held on to 40% ownership when they sold the assets, and the balance was left to
private investors.
To the investors. And sadly, there was an obligation for the investors to service those loans. Those loans were procured dominantly through Nigerian banks and a blend of international financing. They have not been financing this. And there was a threat to the electricity market if those loans were not serviced and they failed. Because what happens? The whole market, comes crumbling. So what BPE is the arbiter or the one that negotiated those contracts, and they had the obligation now to call back those call back those loans, in the sense that they had to come in and reassert or reaffirm their ownership rights within those discos to cause a reshuffling of the management of the discos. This is what has happened. So what we're seeing is a temporary fill gap measure to try and build back trust, pay back, and as soon as that is done, if the disco management meets the requirements and expectations of them, then they have the right to.
Just following up on these explanations that you've provided, one begins to wonder if there was any magic wand that would really simply convert these companies, as we know today, to some profitable ventures that can pay back those. I don't know how realistic that is. And I'm saying this in the light of the fact that we would have expected, as we saw with the telcos, that post-privatization, there should have been some massive financial pump-ins into this, especially to rejig obsolete facilities, improve networks, and sort of recalibrate what they met on ground. They've struggled to do that. Instead, we've seen government bailouts to that sector one time or the other. Are we in a positions where these businesses, as they were, can really make some profit and begin to service those loans going forward?
I think they can. I think they can. So one issue that the discos have always brought up was that they haven't been able to go to the market to get additional funding, because when you look at their balance sheets, their balance sheet is still filled with legacy debts. So no financing entity or financial institution would be willing to give them money. So you see that government has always been, like you rightly said, providing intervention funds. But it seems like it was a sinking fund, because it hasn't met the requirements or obligations for these entities to reject themselves, because most of the money has been going into paying debts as opposed to enhancing infrastructure. So what we're hoping now is there's an ongoing discussion now to remove the legacy debts and all those unnecessary
something
burdens.
Close to what we saw with the ANCON approach to the banks, is that?
I'm sorry?
Remove in what sense? Is it something similar to what we saw with AMCON?
Well, to a certain extent, in a way, maybe transfer, because it wasn't really their debt, so it shouldn't be placed in their balance sheet. So
but I mean, if you acquire a company, you are buying both the asset and the liability.
True, but it's becoming more of a burden, right, than a liability for the sector. So, I mean, it's an ongoing discussion. It would be best for them to transfer that obligation to another entity, maybe NEMCO, right? And so that they can now get competitive financing from the market if they need to. But for now, what we need is bring sanity back to the market. Mm-hmm. How do we now, with the new management, ensure that these discos that haven't been remitting what they should or what they could have are remitting back to the market, that they're closing the metering gap, and that they are working to adequately pay back the loans that they've taken and increase and enhance their infrastructure to meet the challenges. And best of all, look beyond existing scenarios. Look at embedded generation. How do you now bring in a diverse investment pull into the discourse, going to joint ventures, whatever it is, to increase and enhance your network so that you're not overly dependent on a national grid, but looking at alternative sources of revenue to bridge the gap that already exists as we see today.
All right. Well, I'd still like to take you back
Yeah.
to the privatization issue, and this is a fairly straightforward question. You identified that it was what we needed at that time. We needed to privatize so that things could be more efficient. Were we ready?
Well, to be quite honest, our assessment, our analysis then was there was no perfect time, and it needed and had to be done then. And otherwise, we would never be ready. So it was a test for us. In hindsight, could we or should we have done things differently? Maybe. But I strongly believe that we had to do it. Otherwise, we would be facing a more onerous situation than we are now.
Than this?
Than this.
Thank you very much, Chinedu Onyegbulam, a power sector specialist, for the insights that you have provided for us and for our viewers today on the issues that have belabored the power sector. And like you said, this is an ongoing conversation. We hope that when next we come to you, you will be available to further take this conversation forward.
My pleasure. Thank you.